you say
That's it.
Would you say it was defensive? Would you say one of its headlines would be that the BBC is defensive?
Yes, I would. So, for example, another thing, I'm not being boring continually referring back to this memo, but look, another thing in my memo was that there's this strange episode where a group of Oxford historians calling themselves History Reclaimed said, look, every time there's this, not every time, I think they sample 4 or 5 programmes, but they said it's curious, because it was a carefully written report, they didn't overclaim. They were honest about the limited number of shows they'd watched. And they said, we do seem to notice a tendency that in all these shows, instead of getting the foremost historical expert in the field, they're getting people who are far more inexpert, and our suspicion is it's because they're giving them controversial quotes rather than the best take you could possibly get. And the BBC's, and as per my report, I thought this was interesting and should be looked into, because History Reclaimed also had a very simple fix, which was, could the BBC have another look at who they were inviting in from the field of historians to comment on things? That was it. Would the BBC listen? No. And in fact, there were then formal complaints from, I'm guessing, from readers who'd seen that report, based on the report, and the BBC rejected them all and accused History Reclaimed of cherry-picking in a very snotty fashion. Well, History Reclaimed didn't claim to be doing more than that. They said, we've watched 4 or 5 problems. Might be a problem here. Could you take a look at it? The answer was, formal findings, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, we're not talking to you. Extraordinary.
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
I'm sorry?
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
Not institutionally, no. I think it's more... Look, when you run a big outfit like that, you'll all appreciate this, you've got to maintain staff morale, and the management have to be seen to be defending their own folks. And believe it or not, even after that memo, I totally get that. But they get it a little bit wrong, and I think that was an instance, and there are other instances in the memo.
Thank you, Cam.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Prescott, do you think that the BBC is in a better place for the 3 resignations? Do you think public trust should be greater or lower for those 3 resignations?
Ooh. It's very hard to answer, because I think the answer to that depends on each individual citizen's perception of what's gone on.
You speak of culture,
yeah,
which starts from the top, does it not?
Yeah. Usually, yes. So, and you want to know bluntly whether I think it's better or worse for not having Tim Davie and the rest of them there, I guess. Well, look, let me answer this way. For what, I took no pleasure in those people feeling compelled to leave their jobs, number one. And as regards particularly Tim Davie, for what little use or worth this is to him now, firstly, I always liked the guy. And secondly, most importantly, to the extent that inexpert me can judge, he seemed to me to be doing a first-rate job across 80 or 90% of the portfolio. It was just that he had this blind spot on editorial failings. I think it's a bit of a tragedy he's gone. I thought he was a supreme talent, but he had this blind spot.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Michael, were you pleased that your memo found its way into the
No. Gosh.
You're surprised?
As I say, yeah, I was surprised. And first I was surprised. Secondly, as I think I said a little while ago, I was hoping this might be sorted out quietly, you know, board, Ofcom, DCMS. So that's one thing. Second thing is, again, I kind of alluded to this, given what, believe it or not, I was hoping this memo would do good and result in a better BBC being quietly achieved. And the fact it was in the Telegraph, no, I'm not criticising the Telegraph. They gave a lot of space, they took it very seriously. But in sort of ideological terms, the Telegraph appeals to a certain bit of the spectrum, and I think therefore the fact they broke the story became a bit of a barrier to people elsewhere on the political spectrum taking this as seriously or thinking this really was as straightforward as it seems. So that's my answer.
And in terms of the comment that you just made about Tim Davie having a bit of a blind spot in an editorial sense, to what extent do you think that is simply because of the fact that that DG job is just too big for one person?
I've been thinking for a while that it is, and what's happened to Tim confirms that. So again, look, I'm not here to claim I'm the biggest expert in the world on organisational design, but as you asked me, and I was an advisor to this committee, it seems to me, I think the BBC might be well advised to consider having an editor-in-chief on the one hand and a CEO on the other. Yeah. And I very well remember the period in the 80s when they did try that, and John Burt was at first not, in charge of the whole of the enterprise. They did split the role, and I think it's probably worth looking at that again.
Do you have a view on that, Caroline?
On Tim Davie, sorry.
On splitting the role.
Splitting the role. My role was an editorial advisor to the EGSC. I think the issues of whether the overall structure of the BBC and the governance for Tim versus the role is obviously for this committee and for the BBC board itself. It is a very large role and a very complicated role and very hard to get right consistently. And I think in previous times we've had a deputy director general of the BBC, and I think probably it's such a large role and a lot of issues that I think that might benefit from it.
Is that how you'd rather see it split, a DG and a deputy DG, or would you rather, as Michael suggests, have an editor-in-chief alongside a DG?
I don't really have a perspective on it. I mean, I have a personal view as an average person looking at this, but I don't believe.
What's your personal view?
Well, I think my personal view is what I've just said, is I think it would be helpful to have, it's a large job with a lot of responsibilities, and it's an important institution to get this right.
And were you wanting to come in?
Thanks, Chair. One more, Mr. Prescott. You spoke quite highly of Tim Davie. What was your relationship with, excuse if the mispronunciation that is oncoming, Shamit Banerjee? Did you have a relationship with him?
No, I don't know the individual, no. Okay.
Thank you, Cam. Let's move on to Vicky, please.
You rightly pointed out that the Panorama programme has been picked up quite a lot in terms of your note. And this was discussed at 2 meetings of the EGSC in January and May.
Yeah.
Why do you think that the EGSC failed to act satisfactorily at either meeting?
Well, at the first meeting, so if I, probably the best way to answer that, and it'll certainly help me give you a good answer, is if I go through the chronology. So I happened to be at home and I watched that Panorama. It struck me as having issues to do with balance. I didn't think it was quite what I might have expected. I still wasn't too bothered because I thought, well, that's quite an anti-Trump programme, but they'll probably be just as hard on Kamala Harris next week, and they weren't. So I mentioned this at the committee. David Grossman was asked to look into it all, and he came back in January with the findings, which are summarised in my memo. The BBC executive did not seem, how shall I put it, they did not seem very open to accepting what David was saying, and so they were asked, and they agreed. As I say, there was usually consensus on the committee. They very happily agreed to go away and come back with a written response, having, to the mind certainly of me and recollection of me, and I suspect others, seemed to be not open to accepting what David was saying, even though his findings were so stark. So they did come back in May with this written response. Again, parts of the written response are quoted in my memo, and it was black and white. The management did not accept there was a problem either overall with the US presidential coverage or with the Panorama programme. Simple as that.